In the late 80s, lesbian couple Rebecca Wright and Claudia Brenner were enjoying a hiking and camping trip along the Appalachian Trail. Unfortunately, they were no strangers to homophobia. They'd learned to keep their romantic relationship low-key and under wraps in public, since people didn't often react well back then. They'd been victims of verbal abuse for it before, but on this camping trip, they would be stalked and hunted like animals, simply for falling in love with each other. Today, we're going to be talking about the horrifying attack on Rebecca and Claudia. Before we get into the case, I just want to thank our sponsor for making this video possible, Magellan TV. You guys already know that I am a Magellan TV fangirl. It is my place to go for documentaries. I'm always finding really, really good ones on there. And I recently watched a series on there. It was 4 episodes long, all about infamous assassinations and like the psychology behind an assassin. It was called Fatal Shot: Assassinations That Changed the World. And they covered so many cases throughout this series, all the massive ones that you've definitely heard of: Martin Luther King, JFK, Gandhi, Archduke Ferdinand. And it even goes into some like failed assassinations. There was a really interesting story of one of the Manson family trying to assassinate a president because they thought that that's what Charlie Manson would have wanted, and that never ended up, being successful. And there were even a bunch of very recent stories that I'd never heard of from like the 2010s, ones that happened in England as well. A lot of stories of poisoning and attempted poisoning. Just really interesting because we don't cover assassinations on this channel very often, so trust me, I was glued to this series. It's just one of the many, many documentaries that I have loved from Magellan TV. They're always adding new content every single week, so you're never gonna get bored. And actually, Magellan TV are running something really, really cool at the moment. Their 4th annual True Crime Dream Job. It's a competition where they are looking for one super true crime junkie to binge watch 24 hours of true crime. And the best part is, you get paid for it. $100 an hour, that's $2,400 for 24 hours of watching true crime. They're very right, that is the dream job. And you have until September 15th to apply for this on Magellan's website. I'll link the application thing down below. The competition is only for US residents, so I'm sorry if you don't fall under that, but you can still try out Magellan TV, and they are still very kindly giving you guys a special offer when you click the link down below in the description. So if that sounds fun and you want to apply for the True Crime Dream Job, or if you just want to watch some really, really good documentaries, then try Magellan TV. I love them so much, and thanks again to them for sponsoring this video. One last thing before we actually get into the case, I just want to give my usual disclaimer that I mean absolutely no disrespect to anyone that I talk about in this video. This video is for educational purposes, and everything that I'm about to say is publicly available information that myself and my team have found and compiled into one video. This video will cover especially sensitive topics, including but not limited to stalking, sexual assault, and homophobia. This case is a hate crime. So if you feel like these topics might be triggering or too intense for you, then I would recommend clicking out of this video now. Hopefully there'll be another video in future that I will get to see you with, but until then, look after yourself. While we make every effort to fact check our sources and make sure that all of the information in this video is correct, no action should be taken in reliance upon the information in this video. And I want to take this opportunity to remind you that these are real people's lives that we're talking about, so please keep things kind and respectful in the comments. All opinions in this video are mine and mine alone. And with that being said, let's get into the case. So today's case takes place in Pennsylvania in 1988, specifically on a stretch of the Appalachian Trail in Michaud State Forest. I hope I'm saying that right, but it's another AUX word on the end, and I was not born to pronounce those. Michaud State Forest? Anyway, it's in a forest. For a little bit of context on the Appalachian Trail, because you've probably heard of that, but I didn't realise just how big that damn thing is. So it's a public footpath, like a nature path that people go hiking on, and it stretches the entire way from Maine to Georgia. and it goes through forests and mountains, and it's freaking huge. It's over 2,000 miles long, and it has some of the most stunning views imaginable. It's no wonder that people love hiking up there. There's specific camping areas dotted along the Appalachian Trail, so that, I mean, obviously it's going to take you more than one day to trek 2,000 miles. And while a lot of people do try to tackle the whole entire trail on one camping trip, most people do choose to go and do just like a little section of it, you know? And Rebecca Wright and Claudia Brenner fell into that second group when they went for a camping trip on the Appalachian Trail in 1988. The couple had been together for about 3 years at this point. They met when they were at Virginia Tech University together. They were both members of the women's club or the women's group, and both of them were actually on the planning committee for this women's group, and they were going to do this whole Women's Week event at the university. And so the two of them were spending a lot of time together helping to set this up, and it was through that they fell for each other. Rebecca was slightly younger than Claudia. Rebecca was 29 years old at the time of this case, so that will have made her, what, like 25, 26, and Claudia was 32 at the time of this case, so she will have been like 28, 29. Rebecca was a business student, Claudia was an architecture student, and they were both very, very passionate about their studies and about learning and about being the best student, the best worker that they could be. The women just found so much to love about each other, whether it was their work ethic and their passion for their studies, or their passion for beliefs and causes and charities. Rebecca even used to volunteer taking phone calls at a crisis centre. And Claudia just loved that about her, how selfless she was to volunteer time in her very, very busy week. Like, she was a student, she was trying to earn her keep, and she wanted to help other people. Claudia described this early, like, honeymoon stage of their relationship as a wonderful falling in love time. There was a stretch of their relationship where the women had to go long distance. Claudia went to go and study in Israel, and then after that she went to New York. Meanwhile, Rebecca stayed in Virginia. The period of time where Claudia was in Israel was, of course, the hardest. That was when she was the furthest away. But when she moved to New York, they were only about a 6-7 hour drive away from each other, and they made that work. A lot of the time they would actually try to meet halfway, so then they would both only have to do like a 3.5 hour drive each. And this is why they would go hiking and camping, because Rebecca was a very outdoorsy, adventurous person. Claudia, a little bit less so, but because she loved Rebecca so much, she was willing to go on these hiking and camping trips with her. So they would meet up on the Appalachian Trail, and they would go camping for a few days and just enjoy nature and enjoy each other and catch up. And it's very private being in the woods as well. I mean, you don't see that many other hikers, and when you do, it's very brief, you know, you're passing each other. So they just got to be in their own little world for a few days every now and again. In May 1988, they had a long weekend to spend with each other, and so they decided to go on another camping trip. So they headed out to Michaud State Forest on May 12th. It was a Thursday afternoon, and they had their whole weekend planned out to a T. They were going to hike and camp for 2 days, and then they were going to jump back in their cars and drive to Washington to go and see Rebecca's family, because it was her sister's birthday that weekend. They were going to stay, they were going to celebrate for the whole day, I think stay there overnight, and then go back to the forests for one more day of hiking and camping before they both returned to their own homes on Monday. It was a very well thought out plan, but it was very time constricted. So they both set off from their houses on Thursday. They were both driving to this particular patch of the forest that they decided to meet at. And Rebecca got there first, but Claudia was nowhere to be seen. She was having some issues with her car. Her engine kept overheating and almost cutting out. So she was trying her best to kind of not let it get to that point. She was driving with all the windows down. She kept driving like really slow just to help her car make it the whole 3.5 hours. Of course, because she had to drive slower and she had to keep stopping to let the engine cool down, she ended up getting there a considerable amount of time later than Rebecca did. But in that time, Rebecca had just been kind of chilling in the car park, looking at nature, making friends with other hikers. And actually, she ended up making friends with some hikers that were just leaving. They'd just finished their camping trip, and Rebecca told them that she was just about to start theirs. And so they gave her this map that they'd been using, that they obviously didn't need anymore. And this was a really good quality map. Apparently, Rebecca was really, really excited about this. When Claudia arrived, she was already like looking at it. She had it all big and unfolded out, and she was like, I've already found the trail that I want us to take. It was known as the Rocky Knob Trail, and it was like a perfect loop, and it would take them pretty much the amount of time that they had, 2 days plus camping in between then. It was perfect. So they were going to take the Rocky Knob Trail. Eventually, when Claudia got there, they had this little catch up in the car park. They had a little hug. But of course, they kept it quite low-key. This was 1988, and people were still very homophobic and very vocal about their homophobia. The two of them had faced a lot of verbal abuse in their time, and at this point, they decided it was just easier to act friendly in public and be coupley in private. So, they kind of acted like friends reuniting in the car park, but they knew they would be able to kiss and cuddle and do whatever their heart wanted once they were in that tent. So before they set off, they left a note in Claudia's truck saying that they had gone camping and that they would be back on Sunday. And they left that at the end of the trail, and then they hopped in Rebecca's car and drove to the start of the trail and left her car there. So then they wouldn't have to, walk back on themselves to get back to their car. They could do the whole trail and they would have a car at both ends, woo. But actually, we found a really morbid fact about the place that they parked Rebecca's car in the end. It was on a road called Dead Woman's Hollow. It was actually named after a woman that had died in the forest in the early 1900s. She'd been bitten by a rattlesnake and no one knew. And so she died in the forest and no one found her for days. So yeah, they parked their car in a car park on Dead Woman's Hollow, and then they began their hike. The weather was absolutely perfect for them on this long weekend. It had been really quite warm during the day, but at this point when they were starting the hike, it was about 6 p.m, so it was dropping cooler and it was just enjoyable. It was that nice kind of weather where you're not too sweaty, it's not too hot, it's just nice. They knew that they only had a few hours of daylight left, so they were getting a shift on with their hike. They wanted to be able to get to a campsite while it was still a bit light outside so they'd be able to pitch their tent. But they weren't worrying too much. They were just enjoying each other's company for the first time in a long time. They were laughing and joking and holding hands as they walked and catching up. And do you remember I said that Rebecca was an avid camper, whereas Claudia, not so much. And there was a part of the trail where they had to hop over a stream using stepping stones, and Rebecca hopped her way straight across, and Claudia was too scared to do it for a while. It took her a long time to get across, and Rebecca was teasing her and everything. I just thought that was a really cute little memory from the start of this trip. But eventually they made their way to the campsite, one that Rebecca had picked out earlier, and it was a really obviously quite basic campsite. It was all flat so that people could pitch tents, or there were some wooden shelters that people could use. Claudia and Rebecca decided against that, of course, because they were a lesbian couple and they wanted to be able to share a bed and cuddle and maybe do other things that they wouldn't want to do in front of other people in a shelter. So they kind of ignored the wooden shelters, pitched their tent up anyway, and then they set up a little fire. There was a fire pit going. They made themselves dinner. They, again, just sat and chatted for a while by the fire, just enjoying their time together, and then they went to bed. They'd even bought a double sleeping bag so that they could snuggle up together, because sleeping bags are a bit of a cock block, aren't they? They're in two different socks. So they'd got this double sleeping bag. They were really excited to use it, and they snuggled up together. And Rebecca mentioned to Claudia that she really wanted to have a look inside those wooden shelters in the morning to see if they had a guest logbook. What hotels have? Well, they had them at a lot of camping sites. And that's why she wanted to see if this one had one, because a lot of hikers would just leave really interesting tips and tricks and ideas and advice for each other within these books, and she wanted to sign it herself. So they said that in the morning when they woke up, they would go and have a look in these shelters, but for now, bedtime. When they woke up the next morning, the women decided to go about their morning routine still naked. I mean, why not? You're out in nature. They didn't think anyone else was around them. There were no other tents pitched or anything, so they thought they had this campsite to themselves. So why not? They just went with it. They were making their breakfast. They walked down to this nearby stream. They washed off their plates from yesterday, gave themselves a little bit of a wash. They got some water to take back to the fire to boil so that they could have a drink. And over the course of the morning, they were acting very coupley, I suppose, as any couple would be. They thought that they were alone, of course, to the point where they were naked, so why not act coupley as well? Once they were done with breakfast, Rebecca decided to take a walk up to those wooden shelters to see if they had this guest logbook that she wanted to look in and sign. But when she made her way inside, she realised that they hadn't actually been alone this whole time. In there was a man, just one man, on his own, naked, and with an erection. He had been watching Rebecca and Claudia through the window this whole time. And he seemed totally unfazed by Rebecca walking in and catching him. He just said hi and asked her if she had a cigarette, and she said no and swiftly got out of there. She ran back to Claudia at the tent and started panicking and putting her clothes on. She said, "We're not alone here, Claude. We're not alone. We've got to put on our clothes." She described the man to Claudia, said that he was gangly and unkempt and just a total creep. She described how she'd found him with an erect penis. He'd clearly been watching them being intimate together that morning, and they just felt so violated and so uncomfortable that they tried to eat and pack up their stuff as quickly as they could so that they could just move on and just start the hike and get away from this guy. And this was annoying as well, because they planned to actually keep their tent there. They wanted to stay camping there the next night. They were going to go out walking and then return to this same campsite. Of course, the women were quite scared of this man. They didn't want to leave him on bad terms, and so as they left the campsite, they shouted a polite little "see you later" to him, and he shouted the same back. They tried to leave on as much of a positive note as they could, despite what had just happened. And this interaction obviously left them feeling rocked for a good few hours. You wouldn't feel right for a long time knowing that someone had been watching you when you thought you were alone. But all it took was a few hours of laughing and joking and walking and holding hands again to lift their spirits. They were following this particular path, this Rocky Knob trail. And the way that they could tell which trail they were on was that there were like painted lines on the trees in different colours. So they would be following, for example, the yellow lines on the trees. I don't know what colour it was, but they were spotting out all these coloured lines on the trees and following it. They were having a good time. After about an hour of walking, they came to a fork in the path. There were two different ways that they could go, and they couldn't see any of these painted lines on the trees for a little while. So good thing Rebecca had that map now, hey? So she pulled it out, and they're looking at it, they're studying it, trying to figure out where they are and where they want to end up. And that was when they heard a man shouting them. They turned around, and there they saw the same man from earlier, the man from the shelter, and he asked them, "What, are you lost already?" It seemed that he had been following them. He'd followed them from the campsite for a whole hour, and they hadn't noticed that he'd been very quickly behind them. Of course, now they're even more scared of this man than they were this morning. So Claudia tries to keep things, light-hearted, and she responds to him quite sarcastically saying, "No, we're not lost. Are you?" The man just laughed and continued walking towards them. And it was at this point that the women realised he was balancing a rifle on his shoulder. He had a gun. And I mean, people do take guns into the woods, into the forests for hunting reasons. But he hadn't had this gun on him earlier, and he had specifically followed them for an hour with it. They were scared. So they figured out a way to go very quickly, and they just started walking, speed walking down this path. Of course, they didn't want to make it look like they were running away from him. They still wanted to keep the energy polite and positive. So they're walking quickly down this path, and they keep checking over their shoulder to see if he's there, and he doesn't seem to be following them. They can't see him. After an hour or so of this, constantly looking behind them, they were confident that they must have lost him. They hadn't seen him for a long, long time, and they'd even had to slow down at particularly rocky or slippy or steep parts of the path. So if he was following them, he probably would have gained up that distance on them, and he wasn't there. So They were thinking, okay, maybe he just took the other direction at that fork in the road or something. They thought that they were safe. So they keep going for the rest of the day. They are enjoying their hike again. It's a very roller coaster-y hike, but it's nice on the whole. They're enjoying each other's company. They are hiking a hell of a long way until eventually they reach campsite number 2. Again, a really nice flat bit that was right next to a stream. It was perfect. But by the time they reach this campsite, the women are absolutely knackered after a whole day of walking and a whole day of being on high alert as well. They get to the campsite and they just can't be bothered putting the tent up right away. So instead, they just get out the ground sheet and lay it down on the floor so that they can just sprawl out on it and chill out for a little while. The sun was just going down. It was still really warm outside. It was perfect. They were just going to enjoy their evening. They sat there and just enjoyed each other's company, talking, laughing, kissing, cuddling, and then a little bit more than kissing and cuddling. Claudia eventually asked Rebecca if she wanted to put the tent up so that they could, take it to the bedroom. But Rebecca said, no, don't bother. Like, it's really nice and warm out here. They were alone. They couldn't see anyone around. No one else was at this campsite. Why bother putting the tent up, hey? Just carry on the ground sheet. But within minutes of making that decision, it became clear that once again, they weren't actually alone. That man was back. He was hiding 80 feet away in the undergrowth. And now he had his rifle pointed right at Rebecca and Claudia. It's been speculated how he got there because, of course, the women kept looking behind them and he wasn't there. So some people think he might have followed them but just been very agile about it. Other people think that he had predicted where the women would be walking and where they would be camping, and he took a shortcut to get there and then just waited so that he could hunt them like animals. It was all very sudden. One minute they were sitting, enjoying each other's company. The next, they hear a gunshot ring out and Claudia screaming in pain. She'd been shot in the arm, and as she looked down at her wound and saw the blood leaking all over the ground sheet, another gunshot rang out, this time hitting Claudia in the side of the neck. Then a third bullet was fired that hit her in the other side of the neck, and then a fourth that hit her directly in the face. It completely blew her teeth to pieces. All of this happened in the space of about 20 seconds. They'd just been sitting there in the peace and quiet, and then all of a sudden Claudia is shot 4 times. It all happened so fast that the women just didn't even have any time to react. They didn't know where the gunshots were coming from, but one thing they did know, or one thing that they were pretty sure of, was that it was that man from before. He had come back a 3rd time. He had been stalking them all day, and he was specifically targeting them with that gun that they'd seen him carrying. There was no way that this was just a tragic hunting accident where they'd been accidentally hit. Of course not. They were being targeted by whoever was shooting them. At this point, Rebecca snapped into action, realizing that she needed to help save her girlfriend and get both of them out of danger. So she told Claudia to lay down on the ground sheet so that he wouldn't be able to aim at her and target her, although even that didn't work. A 5th shot very quickly rang out and hit Claudia in the top of the head. The shooter just was not giving up, and now Claudia had been shot 5 times. They didn't know how they were going to be able to get away from him, especially because now Claudia was so injured. She was bleeding so much. How could they possibly get to safety in the middle of nowhere? And it was at this point that Rebecca spotted a tree close by, and she thought that would be their only shot of safety, of protection. And so she told Claudia to try to make her way over there and hide behind it, which she did. Claudia got all the way over there and she wasn't shot at again. Once they realized that the shooter couldn't hit them from behind this tree, Claudia starts beckoning to Rebecca to come over as well. But as she got up to run to the tree, Rebecca was shot at twice. She was hit in the back and also in the back of the neck. As she fell to the ground, the man fired one last bullet, an 8th bullet, and this is the only one that actually missed its target. Despite being hit in a critical area, Rebecca managed to shuffle her way behind the tree and back to Claudia. At this point, the gunshots stopped, I think the man thought he probably killed them. He couldn't see them moving anymore. They were hiding behind this tree. And he had obviously been shooting to kill. He was hitting neck, head, back kind of area. That's where you shoot to kill. He must have thought that he had been successful. Claudia and Rebecca were just huddled behind this tree, trying to comfort each other, but also trying to stay as silent as they possibly could, so that genuinely he would think that he had killed them, and so then he would give up. It was clear that they both had life-threatening injuries. They were bleeding so much, and they knew that their only chance of survival was to try to stem them as much as they could on their own until they could get actual medical help. And actually, although Claudia had been hit with more bullets, she had been shot 5 times. It was actually Rebecca, who had only been shot twice, that seemed to be deteriorating quicker. She was very, very weak, very quickly. She couldn't hold herself up, really. She was turning pale, she was slurring her words, she was in and out of consciousness, just trying to tell Claudia to stop the bleeding, stop the bleeding. That was the only thing that she could get out. Claudia did everything that she could. She had a little bit more strength in her, and she knew that she needed to find something to use as a bandage, but of course they had nothing from behind this tree, and so she very bravely got up and ran back over to where all of their stuff was on the ground sheet. She pulled out a bunch of their clothes and ran back to Rebecca and started using these clothes to wrap around her wounds. At this point, the shooter must have left or something, or just not seen Claudia running back to the things, because no more shots were fired. Claudia pressed one t-shirt up against one of Rebecca's wounds and one to one of her own neck wounds that was bleeding a lot. And it seemed to work a bit. The bleeding was slowing a little bit, but of course these injuries were still life-threatening, and Claudia knew that she needed to do something else to be able to save their lives. Right now, the only people that knew that they had been shot were them and their shooter, who obviously wasn't going to be getting them any help. No one was going to come and look for them. No one was on their way to help them. She knew that the only way that they could seek this life-saving medical help would be if she went out and got it herself. She knew she was going to have to try to escape the forest. She managed to pull on some clothes, and she started throwing some of Rebecca's over to her so that she could put her shoes on and all that. But she realised that Rebecca just couldn't move. She was still so weak that she could barely even see her own shoes on the floor next to her. At this point, her vision was greying. She was really falling out of consciousness. She wasn't going to be able to put her clothes on and run to safety with her girlfriend. Claudia tried to put Rebecca's shoes on for her and tried to lift her up and tried to, get her over her shoulder so that she might be able to pull her to safety. But none of it was working. Rebecca just kept slumping down. She just had no energy left in her. And Claudia knew that she didn't have enough energy to barely even take herself to safety, never mind carry her girlfriend to safety. And that was when Claudia had to make the very difficult decision to leave her girlfriend in the middle of the forest on her own, because she knew that she was their only chance at survival. She needed to use whatever energy she had left to go and seek help and send that help back to Rebecca in the woods. By now, night had fallen. It was pretty dark in the woods, and it was getting a little bit chilly. And so before Claudia left, she grabbed their big double sleeping bag and she wrapped Rebecca up in it. This sleeping bag that they had been so excited to share together, that they thought they were going to have so many great memories in, she was now wrapping her up in it to try to save her life. Claudia then pulled on a jumper herself. She grabbed that big map and their torch, and she set off into the forest. She just ran and ran and ran. She wasn't even taking any particular trail because, well, she just wanted to get to the nearest road. So she was running through just bushes and branches, and there was no path that she was taking. Which, a side note, the national parks in the US are freaking huge. As we said, the trail itself was 2,000 miles long. Imagine how much forest there is surrounding that. Even the most experienced hikers in the world can get lost in these forests. You hear all kinds of horrifying stories of people that go missing and then turn up a couple of months later because they got lost, or people that never turn up again. They get lost and they die in those forests because they can't find a way out. But right now, that wasn't even in Claudia's mind. She was just trying to save her girlfriend. Even more than herself, it was saving Rebecca that was powering her through this forest. Remember, she'd been shot 5 times. That's absolutely insane. Bleeding from 5 places, one of which was her face, her neck in 2 places, the top of her head. Like, how she had this kind of energy, it must have been sheer adrenaline that she was racing on at this point. As she ran, she said that she could hear the wounds in her neck gurgling blood as she was breathing, and she felt like her whole arm was on fire. But somehow she managed to run for 3 miles, despite all these circumstances, despite the fear, the darkness, the pain that she was in, the lack of energy, the growing weakness taking over her body. She ran for 3 miles to the nearest road. But when she got there, of course, it was nighttime and this road was completely empty. There was no one on it, there were no cars, and she feared how long it might take for one to appear. She was there for a little while, to the point where she started thinking, shit, I'm gonna have to do something else. She was trying to look on the map to see where the nearest houses might be. She might have to go and knock and try and get someone that way. But it was at this point that she saw some headlights in the distance, and this gave her hope. So she stood on the side of the road, she got her torch out, and she started waving it to try to flag this car down. But it just drove straight past her. When I read that in my research, it was such a gut punch because, of course, we know how desperately Claudia and Rebecca needed help, but you can also kind of put yourself in the position of the person in that car driving possibly alone at night on a dark road, and suddenly you see someone on the side covered in blood. I know a lot of people wouldn't pull over, as much as you would like to think that you would, as much as you would like to think that you would help someone in need. You never know if it is actually someone in need. Because sadly, a lot of situations like this are fabricated as a trap by robbery gangs or kidnappers or, at worst, human traffickers. They will set up these fake situations hoping that someone with a good heart will pull over and want to help, and that's when they get you too. I mean, of course, I'm not saying that that's what this driver was thinking, but as I was researching this part, I don't know. As much as you really wish that that driver would have pulled over, you can understand to a degree why they might not have. But Claudia was once again left on the side of the road with no help, and she knew that when the next car came, she was going to have to step it up to really show them how much she needed their help. So when she saw the next set of headlights approaching, she walked into the middle of the road this time and started waving her torch in giant circles to signal that she wasn't frantic and she wasn't, unhinged. She wasn't a danger. She was just a person that really needed the attention of this car. And luckily for her, this car did stop. Inside, there were 2 teenage boys, aged 16 and 17. They were just on a bit of a joyride that night, going through the forests, which I imagine this situation was very scary for them as well. Imagine being a kid and you're out with your friend in the dead of night and suddenly there's a woman covered in blood in the middle of the road that you have to stop for. You can't really go around her. And luckily the boys did stop. They rolled down the window and Claudia tried to get as much out as she could immediately. She said, "I'm Claudia Brenner. I've been shot 5 times. I need help." So the boys helped her into the car and started driving her to the sheriff's office. Actually, the sheriff's office was even closer than the hospital, and they thought that if they could just get her there, then she would be able to talk to the police and be transported to the hospital by police who could do it quicker. And now that she was in the car, she was able to tell the boys, the full story. She didn't want to give them the full story on the side of the road. They had places they needed to be. So now that she was inside the car, she was telling them that she'd been on a hiking trip with her girlfriend. Her girlfriend had also been shot and she was in worse condition. She'd had to leave her in the forest. She was telling them about this man that had been stalking them all day, and he had a gun and he was weird and he'd been creepy in the morning. She was trying to tell them absolutely every detail that she could because she thought that she could die. She thought that she actually was going to die from her injuries. After all, she'd been shot 5 times. And she knew that just repeating the details over and over to these boys was the only way that if she did die, it would be the only way that this information would ever be heard by police. When Claudia arrived at the sheriff's office, she, of course, still had that map on her, so she was able to give it to the police and circle the exact part of the trail where they'd been camping, where Rebecca still was. Immediately, a search team was sent out to scour the forests to try to find and rescue Rebecca while they still could. In the meantime, they tried to take Claudia to hospital, of course, but she was actually quite reluctant to go. She said that she didn't want to be put in surgery or anything until she knew that Rebecca was rescued. The police tried to comfort her and said, you know, we're going to do the absolute best that we can. We're going to put our all into finding her and saving her. But right now, you need to focus on you. You need to save your own life. You need to go to the hospital. You need these emergency surgeries. And so eventually she did. She was taken in an ambulance to the nearest hospital, but it was quite a small rural hospital. And as soon as she got there and they evaluated her injuries, they realised that they were severely underqualified to be able to deal with a case like this. So Claudia actually had to be airlifted to the nearest specialist trauma centre. As soon as her helicopter landed, she was rushed into emergency surgery to try to remove the bullets from her body and to patch up all of her bleeding. She even had internal bleeding. And by some kind of miracle, Claudia Brenner was treated and would survive being shot 5 times, twice in the neck, once in the head, once in the face. She survived that. One of the shots to her neck had literally torn a hole in her esophagus, which is horrific enough, but it was literally millimeters away from hitting her carotid artery, her vocal cords, and even the top of her spinal cord, which could have paralyzed her from the neck down. To be fair, if it would have hit her carotid artery, that would have just straight up killed her. She was millimeters off of dying. Or imagine she was hitting the vocal cords and then she couldn't communicate to anyone that any of this had happened. She wouldn't be able to communicate that Rebecca was still in the forest and needed saving. And not only that, remember the bullet that hit her in the face and completely smashed up her teeth? Well, she was actually really lucky that it had hit her teeth and her jaw, because they actually helped to barrier the bullet from hitting her spinal cord at the back. There were a lot of tiny little circumstances that meant that Claudia Brenner's injuries weren't fatal. She was incredibly lucky to have survived and made such a good recovery as well. She did require hours and hours and hours of surgeries, and by the time that she was out of her operations and she was in that recovery period, it had been a full day since the attack, since she'd last seen Rebecca. When she was brought back to her hospital room, all of her friends and family were waiting there for her, and that was when they broke the horrible news to her that Rebecca hadn't made it. She'd passed away in the forest before police had even found her. It hadn't taken them that long to find her, honestly, because they had the exact spot that Claudia had drawn on the map, so they went straight there, but her injuries were just so severe that, I mean, she was already dying when Claudia left. When they found her, she was still huddled up against that tree in the sleeping bag, just waiting for her girlfriend to return. When they found Rebecca's body, it was about midnight, and obviously it was so dark outside that they couldn't take like crime scene photos and stuff like that yet. They couldn't do evidence collecting, and so they couldn't move her body. So throughout the night, until the sun came back up, different police officers would take it in turns to sit by Rebecca's body so that she wouldn't be left alone. When the sun did come up, a murder investigation was launched, forensic teams were brought in, all the photographs were taken, searches were done in the immediate area, and they very quickly found where the shooter had been based as this attack was going on. Because of course, Claudia by now could talk to the police, and she was saying, I have no idea where those shots were coming from. They tried to look around, but of course, They were more focused on saving their lives. They didn't see a shooter. But by now, police had found the spot where the shooter had been. It was a little flat patch of land that was completely surrounded by bushes, apart from one tiny little window gap in between the bushes that looked directly onto the campsite where Rebecca and Claudia were. And it seemed that the shooter had left a few things behind. There were about 20 rounds of ammunition just laying on the floor, and also a knitted cap. Once the scene had been searched and photographed, Rebecca Wright's body was airlifted to a morgue. They carried out an autopsy just so that they could have, that information for the criminal case, how many times she was shot, where she was shot. They found that the first shot that had hit her just underneath the neck hadn't been fatal. It would have been very painful, but it only made a bit of a mess of her soft tissue. She would have survived had it just been that one shot. But the second shot sliced through her liver, caused a lot of internal bleeding, and the bullet actually lodged itself in her sternum. She would have been losing a lot of blood from this one bullet wound, and police think that even if Claudia ran as fast as she could and tried to get this help, she wouldn't have been able to rescue Rebecca. No one would. She was already dying as Claudia left. Of course, Claudia Brenner was in pieces hearing this news, hearing that she hadn't managed to rescue her girlfriend. It was going to take her a very long time to be able to process and to grieve for the very sudden loss of the woman that she loved. But for that exact reason, Claudia was very eager to talk to police and give them every detail that she possibly could, because if she couldn't save Rebecca's life, then she was going to make sure that she got justice for her. She immediately recounted everything that she could remember about the day leading up to the shooting, about the man that they'd seen, and then even over the coming days, she would get these random flashes and flashbacks of memories, and she would tell all of those to the police as well. They brought in a sketch artist to help make up an e-fit sketch of their suspect, and they went through multiple rounds of edits and corrections until finally they had this sketch that Claudia was pretty confident looked exactly like that man that had been stalking them through the forest. This sketch was sent out to every newspaper, every magazine, every news channel. It was printed on posters. It was everywhere. And they very quickly saw results from releasing this sketch when they got a call from a woman who said she thought she recognized the man and could potentially identify him. This woman's name was Alice Golden, and she believed that the man in the picture was a family friend of theirs, 22-year-old Stephen Roy Carr. He was a relatively close family friend of theirs who would come over to their house and play with her son. In fact, he would actually teach her son how to shoot at bottles and birds. He had his own guns that he would bring round and teach her son to shoot. She said that Stephen Carr had a huge interest in guns. He had a bunch of his own. He was quite a gun fanatic, and actually, he literally lived in the forest. I don't know if he even had an address or if he was literally just living off the land in the forest. He would use the wooden shelters out there. Sometimes he would even set himself up in a cave. And Alice said that he would return to her family home like once or twice a week so that he could use their bathroom, freshen up, shave, sometimes enjoy dinner with them, and then he would wander back out into the forest and continue living like a literal caveman. A very interesting sounding fella, and actually the exact kind of fella they imagined would commit a crime like this. A literal caveman. Stephen Carr was born in 1959, originally in New York, but when he was still a baby, his family moved to rural Pennsylvania. He was said to be quite a loner in school. He found it very difficult to make and keep friends, so he eventually just went about life solo. He eventually dropped out of school at 15 years old. He had no qualifications, and I think one of the reasons for him dropping out of school was because his mother moved them to Florida. Although he didn't rejoin a school in Florida, he was just a 15-year-old just kind of on the streets at that point, and he started getting into some kind of bad groups. He was making friends with criminals who would teach him how to rob shops and how to mug people, and you know, he was in really, really bad circles now in Florida. At the age of 19, Stephen and one of his friends were actually arrested for stealing people's checks out of their mail. They would steal big batches of mail that were coming to, I think, this one particular motorhome. So they were targeting only this one person. Of course, they're going to realise that their mail's going missing. But anyway, they would steal these batches of mail from him and open it all up. And if he had any physical checks in there, they would just pocket them. And actually, when the boys were found out for this, because it didn't take very long for this person to report it and police to figure out who did it, and they turned up at the boys' homes to arrest them. And so they grabbed all these checks and tried to flush them down the toilet to get rid of evidence, and it didn't work. So they just had a blocked toilet that police then fished the checks out of, and they were like, okay, explain this. The two of them were charged with grand theft because up until this point, when they got caught, they'd actually managed to successfully pocket over $1,000 doing this. He went to prison for a little while, but I couldn't find any information on like what his time was like there. In fact, we will mention one thing a little bit later on in the case, but it seemed that he was in and out of prison. A few years later, he was in trouble with the police once again for theft, but this time for also stabbing someone while he was robbing them. He was part of a robbery ring at this point. Sorry, that sounds like rubber ring. He was part of a robbery ring. There were about 8 or 9 of them, and they were successfully carrying out these like home invasion robberies for a while. That was until they robbed an elderly lady who lived alone, and Stephen stabbed her. Luckily, she survived the attack and she was able to give descriptions to the police, and eventually this robbery ring that he was part of was caught. And at this point, they'd managed to connect them with a bunch of other home invasion robberies that they'd been looking into but had no idea who had done them. Police started making arrests from this robbery ring. They'd arrested a few of them, and obviously they were looking at huge charges. They had committed so many home invasion robberies at this point that police knew they were responsible for. And Stephen kind of had it the worst out of all of them because he'd also stabbed an old lady. What the fuck? I genuinely couldn't believe that when I read it. This is a 20-something-year-old man. What is this elderly lady actually gonna do to you that is a threat? She isn't a threat to you whatsoever. There was no need for him to stab her. But obviously, because he would be getting the worst charges, the worst sentencing out of all of them. He knew that his life would be over if he was caught by the police. So Stephen Carr decided to flee the state to escape prosecution. And I guess it makes sense now why he lives in caves and in the forest and doesn't have an address, because he was running from the law. Yeah, he ran away from Florida back to Pennsylvania where he grew up, and from that point on, he was just a forest dweller. He would mostly hunt and fish and gather for his own food. He was really living off the land in that forest like a genuine caveman. I know I keep saying it, but you'd never hear of like actual real cavemen in the modern day. I'm not entirely sure how he met Alice and her family. I don't know if he already knew them from when he lived in Pennsylvania before. I really don't know what the situation was there, but like I say, he would join them a couple of days a week. They would feed him, he would use their bathroom, their facilities. So he had an all right deal. But outside of Alice's family, we were not aware of any other social connections that he had. He really was just another creature in the forest. Alice told police that the last time she had seen Stephen Carr was on May 14th, which was the day after the shooting. She said that he'd come to their house and he didn't seem like himself. He was very disturbed and he kept talking about how he'd done something wrong, and at one point as he was talking about it, he was getting tears in his eyes. And that was the last time that he'd come to visit them, which was weird enough on its own when it had been like a week or 2 weeks or whatever, and they realised that he wasn't coming. They knew that something must be wrong because they were his only friends. They were his only bathroom. They were his only warm meals, you know? And then Alice sees this news report about this man that shot at 2 women on the Appalachian Trail, and she sees this sketch, and it is Stephen Roy Carr. The sketch looked exactly like him, all of the circumstances were spot on, and she hadn't seen him in ages, and the last time she saw him, he was talking about how he'd done something wrong. She knew it had to be Stephen. The police did believe Alice when she was telling them this, but of course, being the police, they have to get evidence of things. They can't just go off on something hoping it's true. So they figured out a way to confirm Stephen Carr's identity. They took that hat that had been left at the crime scene and they sent it for forensic testing, where they found a bunch of tiny little white cat hairs on it. Turns out that Alice had a white cat, and it was a match. The hairs on the hat were from the cat. So that proved that she was telling the truth, that she knew Stephen Carr, that Stephen had been at her house, and that Stephen had been at the murder scene. Police asked Alice if they could search her house and her garden for any other evidence that he might have left there. And in the garden, they found a bunch of bullet casings from when he would teach her son to shoot at birds. And these bullet casings were the exact same bullet casings that they found at the murder scene. So now a search for Stephen Roy Carr was underway. It was going to be a hard one, but it was underway. Meanwhile, Claudia was still recovering in hospital. She was in hospital for about 11 days after all of her surgeries. Actually, she was in hospital that long that she missed Rebecca's funeral, which absolutely broke my heart to hear. She only just missed it as well. Like, if she'd have been discharged just a couple of days sooner, she would have been able to go and lay her girlfriend to rest, but she couldn't. And so actually, this is a really sweet part. Her mother brought her a Shiva candle to the hospital, which is something that Jewish people do when a very close loved one dies. After they've laid them to rest, they will light this Shiva candle, and for 7 days it burns, and for those 7 days you're supposed to mourn and grieve this person and remember them, and the candle, the flickering flame, is supposed to be a symbol of the light that they brought into your life. And even just this act of Claudia's mother bringing her the Shiva candle to be able to honour and remember her girlfriend was really, really sentimental for Claudia, because it had been hard for her coming out as a lesbian. I'm not entirely sure how her family took it, so I'm not going to comment on that. But because her mother brought this candle for her to remember her girlfriend, this was a very validating moment for Claudia, that her mother recognised Rebecca as a very, very important part of her life, and her mother wanted her to be able to lay her to rest properly. I don't know, I thought that was also just a really nice part of it. Claudia felt just very accepted and very understood in that moment. I think a big part of that is that when Claudia originally came out, she actually distanced herself from her Jewish practices. She didn't really partake in much of it anymore. So again, it was a really big moment that her mother kind of invited her to practice this tradition. From this point forward, Claudia found a lot of comfort in her faith. She started reconnecting with her practices, and it really, really helped her on her healing journey. So, back to the police investigation. Of course, at this point, they've identified who their killer is, but they have no idea where the hell he is. I mean, there's a good chance he had run back off into the forest, and, you know, they were just gonna have to scour the whole fucking thousands and thousands of miles of forest for him. But there was also an equally good chance that he ran away from the forest, because obviously that's where they're gonna try to find him. So, I don't know, they didn't really know where to look. Do you look in the forest? Do you look away from the forest? Luckily though, the case ended up solving itself, pretty much. After a few days of hunting for Stephen Carr, it turned out that he hadn't gone back into the forest. He'd actually run off and joined a Mennonite community. Mennonites are a group of strictly Protestant Christians, and they're very similar to like Amish communities in that they don't do technology. They don't do TVs, phones, they don't even do like motorized vehicles, which I guess is ideal for a murderer on the run, because no one in this community knew that he was a wanted man. None of them had seen the news reports or the police sketch or anything. But the way that this all came about, right, and I find this a little bit funny, he had fashioned a makeshift raft and was just going down a river. I don't know how or why, but whatever. He was going down this river when he eventually stumbled across a woman named Esther from this Mennonite community who was like clearing up the riverbank. She spots this man on this very tatty raft that he'd clearly made himself, and he was, unkempt, disheveled, and she called out to him and asked if she could help him. Stephen said yes, actually, he could do with some help. He actually really needed food. He was very hungry. And so Esther tried to help him bring his raft in. They tied it to the side of the river, and she brought him to come and meet her whole community. He introduced himself as Mike Smith. He said that he'd been hiking in the national parks, and he'd been hit by some really dreadful weather to the point where he had to fashion himself a raft to try to survive. I don't really know. But I mean, he clearly looked in a bad way. He was very disheveled, he was very hungry, and the community took pity on him. They did want to help him, but of course they didn't quite know if they could trust him. And so they asked him, they quite obviously asked him, look, can we trust you to bring you into this community? Do you, what are your intentions here? And Stephen responded to Esther saying, lady, I'd rather do you good than harm. So with that, they trusted Mike Smith and they brought him into the community. They gave him a bed to sleep in for a little while. They fed him all his meals. And then after a couple of days, he starts earning his keep. He starts working the farms and tending the animals and cooking and cleaning with the community. He became a part of their little civilization. And of course, at this point, Stephen is thinking he has hit the jackpot. He has found a group of people that actively want to provide him with everything that he needs: community, food, clothes, warmth, shelter, everything. And they don't watch the news. They don't know that he's a murderer, they don't know that he's wanted, and they're not gonna because they don't have TVs. So he's thinking at this point, wow, I could actually get away with this forever. He could just make a new life in this community and just live forever like this. And it's really scary how easily that could have worked for him. But luckily it didn't. So the family that he was staying with, I don't know if it was Esther's family that he was staying with or if it was a different family within the community, but he'd been staying with this family and they would take him to church with them. And it was when he arrived at this church, a young man saw him, a young man that had secretly been watching the TV and not telling his community. This young man saw him, recognized him from the news reports as a murderer, and it was him that raised the alarm. I think he went and told one of the higher-ups in the church, he had to kind of confess to his sin of watching TV, and he said, but this man is a murderer and we need to contact the police. And so they did. The police came down to where this community was based, but they didn't go into their village or town. They kind of stayed on the outskirts because they didn't want to make it apparent to anyone there that the police were here. Because of course, as soon as Stephen Carr hears that the police are here, he's gonna make a run for it. So instead, police start setting up roadblocks all around the town so that he wouldn't be able to get out using a road anywhere. And it was actually at this point, before they'd even managed to block off all the roads and make their way in, that the family that Stephen was staying with, the family start driving out of the town in their car, and obviously they reach a police roadblock and they're like, hey, what's going on? And so the police tell them, look, there is a wanted man within your community. We're here to finally arrest him. And they ask if they can check their car and everything and talk to them about this investigation. And they hand the family a flyer with the police sketch on. And that was when they realized that Mike Smith, that had been living in their family home, helping them tend the animals and the crops, Mike Smith was a murderer. Imagine finding out that you had done this really good deed, invited someone in need into your home, you've clothed them, fed them, given them shelter, given them a job, they've lived under a roof with your children, and then you find out that they're a murderer, and this whole time you have been unknowingly helping them get away with their crimes. So the family told the police that at this moment in time, so it was very early on in the morning and work hadn't started yet on the farm, they said at this moment in time he will be getting ready to do the work day, and his first task of the day is to move the cows from the field to the barn or from the barn to the field, moving the cows anyway. That was his first task. And he was due to do it with their children. So they said to police, look, he's going to start doing this like within the next half an hour or so. So if you want to try and ambush him while he's out in the open, just in a field where he's not going to be able to run away from you, get down to the field now. They had a bunch of different outhouses and sheds that the police could hide in, so it didn't look suspicious. And of course, when Mike Smith, Stephen Carr, came out to deal with the cows, police arrested him. Quite surprisingly, when the police did pop out of their hiding places and arrest him, Stephen went quite easy. He didn't put up a fight, he just let them arrest him. But I think a big factor in that was that he wasn't told that he was being arrested on suspicion of murder. He was told that they were here to arrest him on those outstanding charges of the burglary ring from back in Florida. You know, the ones that he escaped from, and that's why he's been living in the forest. They were just acting as if they'd finally found him for those charges. The main reason they did this was because they wanted to see what kind of information he would volunteer up on his own. When he doesn't know that they're suspecting him of having anything to do with these women, what's he gonna say? They started by asking him what he'd been doing since he fled from Florida. Like, where's he been? How's he been living? And he told them that he had been living on the Appalachian Trail. He had been hunting for his food. So already he'd given up location where the murder happened and the fact that he had guns and regularly shot them in the forest. But actually, he then told them this other little piece of information. He said that he had been robbed in the forest on May 13th, the day of the murder. He said that he had been robbed while he slept. Someone had stolen his gun. Of course, as soon as police hear this, they know that this is his first attempt at trying to cover up the murder before they've even gotten to it. Because now, if they did connect his gun to the murder, he'd be able to say, well, oh, it must have been the person that stole it. The person must have stole it so that they could murder someone. Promise it wasn't me. Police knew it was all bullshit, but they kept humouring him and they kept asking him, you know, about this stolen gun. They were acting as if they were taking it seriously and they were going to look into this for him. So they asked if he'd seen anyone in the area at the time that his gun was stolen. And he said there wasn't really anyone about, just two young women that spoke to him whilst buck naked. Police eventually told Stephen some good news, that they had found some of the ammunition that had been stolen along with his gun, and his face lit up. But then they told him it had been found at a murder scene, and his face dropped again. As they talked about it, Stephen actually burst into tears and started saying things like, why does this always happen to me? Why does this keep happening? Police just confronted him at this point and said, look, we know that you shot at two women. And that was when they broke the news that one of those women had died. He had murdered one of them, and one of them had survived and managed to give over all of this information to police. That now means that he is being arrested and he will be in prison forever. He's still crying at this point, and he says to them, if I tell you the truth, you'll put me away for a long time. I should have run. And then, in a last-ditch attempt to try to get away with the murder, he said that he thought he was shooting at a deer. What, so you kept shooting 8 times? What about when the women were getting up and running behind this tree? At that point, of course you will have seen that you're not shooting at a deer, you are shooting at 2 humans, and he kept going. I don't believe that for 1 second. Police were starting to lose their patience with him at this point, and they were like, look, we know you're the killer. You might as well confess. We have so much evidence against you, and we literally have a surviving victim that, if need be, she will be able to identify you in a police lineup, so you might as well just confess. And confess he did. He told them that the gun wasn't actually stolen. We already knew that, but anyway, he confessed that his gun wasn't actually stolen and that he'd hidden it, he'd wrapped it in plastic and then buried it out in the forest. So of course, police go and recover this buried gun, and when they test it against the bullets that were recovered from Rebecca and Claudia's bodies, they found that the bullets came from this exact gun. With that, Stephen Roy Carr was charged with first-degree murder, third-degree murder, attempted murder, and 2 counts of aggravated assault. A month later, he had his preliminary court hearing, which is where he's supposed to plead guilty or not guilty, and that's where they decide if it's going to go for trial. But I mean, this one was kind of like a mini trial within itself. They had the defense and the prosecution giving their arguments. And in this preliminary court hearing, it became very clear what the motive for the shooting was, and I'm sure you can guess it. His defense stood up there and said that when he saw the women naked in the forest, being so sexual and intimate with each other, they said that that triggered him. And that's for a few reasons. The first being just general homophobia. He did not like to see two women being together as a man and a woman should. You know, like, he said that it disgusted him, but it also made him very jealous. And he was he was an incel, of course. I mean, you live out in the forest. He doesn't have a social life. He doesn't have a sex life or a romantic life. And he said it was just very triggering, first of all, to see two people having sex, but the fact that those two people were women drove him over the edge. He said that he felt taunted by it, seeing it multiple times in one day. He'd seen it that morning and seemed to enjoy it, dirty pervert. But then he'd also stalked them through this whole trial and then saw them getting intimate again. And he said that they essentially provoked him to kill them. As I was researching this case, I've genuinely, I don't think I've ever come across this in a case where they are so blatantly just trying to use homophobia as an excuse for murder. Like, that is his defense, that they were gay and I didn't like it. And they were trying to use some kind of like gay panic defense. And it, of course not. Shut up. What do you mean? Shut up. I just got really, really mad. What do you mean you're going to stand up there in court and say, yeah, it was my homophobia and my hatred, but I should be let off for that? Like, what? Ugh. Like, I want to know how the conversations went between him and his lawyer, where they were like, okay, cool, yeah, homophobia, that's going to work. There was one argument that his defense tried to use, which, remember I said earlier, he had a little stint in prison when he was about 18, 19, and apparently he was raped whilst in prison, of course, by another man. And he tried to say in court that seeing these two women in a homosexual relationship brought back a lot of trauma from the time that he was raped by another man. And so he tried to kill them. I just think that is such a reach to explain why you stalked them for a whole entire day and then shot 8 rounds at two terrified women as well. They're trying to run away from you and you are still trying to aim at them. I just can't understand that reasoning whatsoever. That doesn't explain why you stalked them the whole day. It wasn't a case of trauma coming back and flashbacks and, you know, like a whole spur of the moment episode type thing. This was a prolonged, planned attack. By the way, the whole time that his lawyer is saying all of this in court, Stephen is sat there with the most stone cold, emotionless demeanour you've ever seen. And I especially think that if this attack had been provoked by trauma in him, then surely talking about it all would bring something up. But no. He was so emotionless. Stephen eventually opted to take a plea deal where he would plead guilty to the first-degree murder of Rebecca Wright, and if he did that, all of his other charges would be dropped. So attempted murder, aggravated assault, which is a bit of a punch in the face for Claudia. I mean, those are all the charges relating to her and what she'd been through. But also at the same time, she didn't really care that much about her own justice, just as long as she got justice for her girlfriend. Just as long as he was put behind bars for what he had done to Rebecca, she was happy. And so when he decided to take this plea deal, that's all she could really ask. The main reason that he took this plea deal was because the death penalty would have been on the table if he'd tried to plead not guilty to it all, so that way he was only going to get life in prison. And he did. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He is going to die behind bars. He has since tried to appeal this a few times, but it's never actually gone anywhere. and I hope it never does if he does try to appeal it in the future. Since her recovery, Claudia Brenner has very bravely gone full steam ahead with her life. She hasn't let this hold her back in any way. She went and finished her master's degree in architecture, and now she has her own architecture company called Claudia Brenner Design. She also went on to write a whole book about her ordeal named 8 Bullets, One Woman's Story of Surviving Anti-Gay Violence. In the book, she talks, of course, all about the shooting itself and her recovery, the aftermath, the police investigation, but she also just goes into what it was like to be a gay woman in the 1980s. How people would treat her and Rebecca when they would go out into the street, all the verbal abuse that they'd faced before, and then, of course, it led up to this, her literal murder. Claudia talks about how she really, really struggled with PTSD after the attack. And actually, a lot of other survivors of horrific attacks have read Claudia's book, and it's been very, very helpful to a lot of people. And I think that's lovely when things like this can come out of such a tragic, awful case, but can help others. I think that's wonderful. Claudia didn't have to sit down and relive all of that and get it all out into a book. She could have just put it all behind her and continued on with, you know, her architecture company. But I think it's very, very sweet that she wanted to help other people in a similar situation to herself, whether it be people with PTSD, people that have been through anti-gay violence and homophobia like her and her girlfriend. I just think that's wonderful. If the book is still available, I will link it down below in the description. I think that would be a good read. Unfortunately, I didn't have time to read it myself, but you know, I'll pass it on to you, hey. But that is all I have for this case. Thank you so much for watching. I think this has been a pretty long one. Thanks again to Magellan TV for sponsoring this video. Remember, if you want to try out their streaming service, there'll be a link down below with a special offer available. Or if you want to apply for their true crime dream job competition, you have until September 15th. And again, link is down below in the description. But yeah, thanks so much for watching. If you want to watch another one of my videos, there should be one on screen right now, or you can click the little circle with my face in to subscribe, because we post true crime content on this channel every single week, and I would love to see you here again. Cool. Anyway, bye!